We're excited to have you here at this summit that has been taking place yesterday and today. Today is the second day of the summit, and we'll focus on topics that are about women's health and wellness and the effects it has on their families. I want to remind you, please put your name, your organization, parent, professional in the chat box. Please use the chat box for comments or questions. This session is being recorded and streamed on our SPAN Facebook group. We will also put resources, the PowerPoints in the chat box as well.
Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, either for the first time or the second time if you were here with us yesterday. We are really excited to be with you today and get through these wonderful presentations we have in store. My name is Jeanne McMahon. I am the Director of Health and Family Support Projects at SPAN. Today we have two presentations, in fact, Adverse Childhood Experiences, which will be presented by Aldina from New Jersey American Academy of Pediatrics, and Domestic Violence and Effects on Children and the Impact on Children. Let me move on and introduce Aldina. Aldina has been a child advocate for more than 20 years. She currently serves as a program director at the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, as I mentioned earlier, where she leads child abuse prevention and anti-human trafficking efforts. She has co-authored articles on human trafficking children and children's mental health. Aldina holds a master's degree in social work from Rutgers University with a concentration in administration, policy, and planning for children and families. Aldina currently serves on the New Jersey Commission on Human Trafficking and the Board of Trustees for the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And she is a member of the American Hospital Association's Human Trafficking Advisory Council, the New Jersey Child Assault Prevention Advisory Board, and the Prevention Committee of the New Jersey Task Force on Child Abuse and Neglect. So without further ado, I'd like to jump right in and hand the mic over to our colleague, Aldina. So Aldina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Or I'm sorry, Jeanne. I was looking at Nicole. So thanks so much. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences and COVID-19, and a little bit about systemic racism, since that is something that is obviously impacting our world today. Next slide. So I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who have been doing this work way longer than I have. One of the people who have really brought this conversation about ACEs to the forefront was Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is now the first Surgeon General ever in the state of California. She is also the founder of the Center for Youth Wellness. She's now the person who is leading efforts in California to do screening for adverse childhood experiences with her organization, ACEs Aware. Also ACEs Connection, and of course, many of my colleagues and staff members at the New Jersey chapter. So again, my name's Aldina Hovde. I'm a program director at the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I have developed this program called Healthy Spaces, which is really aimed at promoting healthy and resilient communities. I don't have any disclosures to make. So learning objectives today are, one, to define and understand adverse childhood experiences, what they are, adverse community environments, and social influencers of health. It's a different term. I'll tell you why I like that better than determinants. To really help people understand how ACEs impact us here in New Jersey, to understand toxic stress and its impact on the developing brain, to explain how protective factors can provide a buffer to lessen the impact of toxic stress and ACEs, to understand the impact of COVID-19 on children and families, to learn how to look for signs of trouble and how to start talking to kids about their concerns, and to learn how to take care of yourself and your family during these difficult times. So adverse childhood experiences. So for those of you who don't know, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was conducted jointly by Kaiser Permanente, which is the largest HMO in the United States, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's the largest study of its kind ever done to really look at the health and social effects of adverse childhood experiences over the lifespan. So over 17,000 Kaiser patients participating in routine health screening volunteered to participate in the study, and researchers surveyed adult participants about their childhood experiences. The survey information did not, however, include asking about the duration of that experience. So whether they experienced these adverse childhood experiences for a week or for 10 years, we don't know that information based on the details we received in the study. Next slide. So I think it's important to first look at what are those questions that were asked. These are the original 10 questions. On this page is 5, and then we'll show you the other 5. And I think it's important to know that these questions were asked in terms of, prior to your 18th birthday, did any of these things happen to you? So really it's when you were a child, did any of these things happen to you? So I'm going to go through a couple of them. I'm not going to go through all of them because you all can read that. But the first one, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that you feel like you might be physically hurt? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Or going down to number 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough food to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you? Or were your parents too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Next slide. So it finished up with really asking about divorce, abandonment, or really death of a parent. So for other reason, did you ever lose a biological parent for another reason? And that could also include death. Was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped? So really getting to the domestic violence questions. Question number 8 is really getting to whether or not someone had been a witness to or around someone who drank or used drugs regularly. Number 9 is really asking about mental illness. Did they have someone in the household that was mentally ill? And number 10, did anyone go to prison that was in the household? Oh, go back one. So the National AAP looked at, are there other questions that we should be asking? So those 10 are really the baseline. But over the years, since the original research was done, they really started looking at what are some of the other questions that we might want to ask about. Should we be asking about, community violence or bullying or any of these sorts of things? And I think the answer is yes, we should be asking about all of these things, but at some point you have to put we can't keep parents in our offices for that long a period of time to be able to ask about absolutely everything. So what are the really important things to ask about? So the AAP came up with these few items that we thought were really important to really consider. Next slide. So I say some types of ACEs because, again, there are a lot of different adverse childhood experiences that we could think about. So here are just a list of some of them. So if you look at the diagram here, so for abuse, there's physical, emotional, and sexual. For neglect, there's physical and emotional. And household dysfunction, there are all of these things. There's mental illness if you have someone who's incarcerated that lives in the home. A mother treated violently, and I think I would go so far as to say anyone who's treated violently in the home. Substance use, and then divorce. So as you can imagine, the list here is ever evolving, and it keeps changing over time. I added COVID-19 and racism and discrimination on this list as well, because I think these are other things that are appropriate, and children who are exposed to these things are really at a much higher risk, as we'll learn about later, for a lot of different health problems. So the original study participants, so between 1995 and 1997, there were over 17,000 people who, as part of their physical exams, completed this confidential survey, and asking them about all of their childhood experiences and what their current health status and behaviors were. So I think it's important to note that in the original study that was done, there were roughly equal amount of male and females. They were primarily white. There were almost 50% of them were over the age of 60. And about 40% were college graduates, and 36% had some sort of college. And I think it's important to note here that since the original study was completed, a lot of other researchers have replicated this study in different settings. One was in Philadelphia. And I think what's interesting about this, when you look at the demographics here in the original ACEs study, the results are pretty much the same when you look at all of the different populations that they've looked at. So I think that's really important to note, especially when we think about ACEs and we think about what the stereotypes or the thoughts might be around those who are experiencing ACEs. It's everybody. One population is not excluded from experiencing ACEs. Next slide. So study results. These are the results of the original study. I'm just going to go through a couple of these things, but 11% suffered emotional abuse, 28% had been physically abused, 21% sexually abused, which is huge. 27% had a person in their household with substance abuse, 13% witnessed domestic violence, which you'll hear a little bit more about after my presentation. 23% had either separated or divorced parents. 15% and 10% had been emotionally and physically neglected. Next slide. So this is the most interesting to me when we look at ACEs and what that relationship is between health and behaviors, and even potential for moving forward in life. Researchers really looked at this, and they looked at things like obesity and diabetes, depression, all kinds of mental health concerns, suicide attempts, cancer, stroke, all of these different things. And they found that there was literally, and you'll see this in just a few minutes, there was a direct dose response relationship between all of these health, behavior, and life potential outcomes and adverse childhood experiences. And researchers have really looked at this with over 40 outcomes to date. Next slide. So in 2006, so several years after the original ACEs study, investigators followed up to see which of the individuals surveyed had passed away. And they found, this is what's really shocking, they found that people who reported 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, on average, lived 60 years, while those who reported fewer lived on average to be 79 years or older. So I think that's unbelievable when you think about the 20 years of life, roughly, that had been lost as a result of all of these adverse childhood experiences. And I should note that they're still looking at these adverse childhood experiences and how they're related to life and longevity. They're still analyzing this data and really looking at those health and social and life outcomes that are happening. So as a result of childhood trauma. So I think that's just really important to note that that research continues. Next slide. Oh, we missed one. There we go. So this is actually a trailer for a film, Resilience, the biology of hope and the biology of stress and the science of hope. And I think it's really helpful. It kind of goes through a little bit of what we just went over, but it puts it into a context for you. So if we can play that.
We all like to think of childhood as this time of joy and innocence. But, I mean, for many of us, it's just not true.
When you grow up in these type of situations, it's not something you talk about. I know I didn't.
The first thing that we found is that adverse childhood experiences are common.
Kids are young, they don't know what's going on, they won't remember anyway. Well, the child may not remember, but the body remembers.
There was this incredible gee whiz effect. You mean adverse childhood experiences cause heart disease and lung disease and liver and cancer?
Exposure to trauma affects children's developing brains. The impact is on your behavior, it's on your heart, it's on your DNA. Like, how do you deal with all that?
I don't reach out because I'm not used to that.
We have a whole new body of knowledge now that could open up what we have up till now been seen as intractable, unsolvable problems.
No child should be punched or kicked. No child should be punched or kicked.
If you can get the science in the hands of the general population, they will invent very wise actions.
Do you feel like any of the interventions have been making a difference?
They may all be.
It's there, it's possible. And a defeatist attitude is completely disconnected from what 21st century science is telling us. And we should be going after that like a bear.
Thanks so much. So one of my favorite quotes in that trailer is, if you put science into the hands of the population, into the community, they'll invent very wise actions. And that's really the premise of the work that we're doing at the New Jersey chapter of the AAP with our Healthy Spaces program. We're going directly into the communities, bringing everybody together and saying, how can we address this? What's your community look like? And how can we address adverse childhood experiences in your community? Tell us about your community. Tell us what's happening. So I think, to me, that's the most important kind of takeaway, is that we really do need to be partnering more, right? Everyone needs to be partnering more with their communities, with their parents. Yes, I'm happy to share the link to the video. It's in the PowerPoint presentation, but I'm happy to share that with Nicole and Jeanne, and we can get that out to you for sure. So, okay, and we do also have the rights to the film Resilience. So, we'd be happy to set up a time where we can share that whole film. So no worries at all. So I thought it was important, since we're talking about ACEs, to really look at, well, what does the data look like here in New Jersey? So in 2017, and that's the most recent data that we have, because we're always, kind of looking back, there were over 77,000 investigations of child abuse and neglect. Of those investigations, there were about 6,300 that were substantiated and found to be true, that a child had been abused or neglected. And of those cases, there were a little over 600 or 6,000 victims noted of child abuse. So the other data that we have, which is more recent actually, is that over 40% of children in our state, or over 782,000, had one or more adverse childhood experiences. I think the other thing that's really important to know, and something that really shook me to my core, was learning about some of the fatalities and how that happens. So 18 children died from as a direct result of child abuse and neglect in 2018 alone. Many were just days or weeks old. Not many were actually known to DCP&P, despite what some folks might think. Substance use was a major factor here. And the last bullet here is what I want to highlight. 3 times the rate of child abuse and neglect fatalities in high poverty areas. So from 1994 to 2014, researchers looked at some child abuse fatality data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of children from the ages of 0 to 4 who had died due to child abuse. And they found that the counties with the highest rates of poverty had 3 times the rate of child abuse and neglect fatalities than those who had low rates of poverty. And that means that we need to be doing more to address poverty, right? We need to do more to address that in our state. So I know that's something that we're committed to as a chapter, and I know there's a lot of work. Currently, there's a lot of energy around addressing that in our state, which I think is wonderful because it definitely needs to happen. Next slide. So we'll hear more about this, so I'll just touch on this now, but we'll hear more about this a little bit later. There are a lot of domestic violence offenses reported in our state. Many of them do involve children in some way, at least they're present. Domestic violence also includes, obviously, substance use as a factor. Many of them have assaults. But I also wanted to know that, it's traumatic for children, whether they're, directly involved or just witnessing, but it is absolutely traumatic for children, and it increases their risk of abuse or neglect in the home. Next slide. So adverse community environments. So there are realizing that people live in communities and they venture out of their house, at least they used to, right? We don't do that as often as we used to. But researchers developed this pair of ACEs model to really look at the roots of the tree, so to speak, that impact families. And you can see some of these things under the tree, such as community violence, discrimination, poverty, poor housing, violence, all of those sorts of things. Next slide. So I stole this slide with permission from a conference that I attended back in 2018 on community trauma. So of course, there are always things that are included at the level of detail, at this level of detail. But when I attended this conference, they shared this slide. I found it again as I was preparing this presentation, and I thought it was really relevant given our current state of the world with this systemic racism that we're dealing with there's still people who are judging people based on the color of their skin, which really gets me to the core. There's or based on religion or whatever the case may be, their community where they live, whatever it is. I think these are all other community traumas that may not be listed in the original ACEs study or listed in even that tree, but I think we need to be considering these things when we're talking about this, how trauma impacts health and well-being. Next slide. So social influencers of health. So I gave you a little bit of a hint that I don't like the word social determinants of health earlier. I like to call them influencers because I feel like when you start saying social determinants, there's no choice, right? You're stuck, you have no way out. And I don't like to think of it like that because I think there are too many examples of people who have suffered from or been influenced by these sorts of things, that have had food insecurity or live in, poor neighborhoods or deal with community violence or whatever the hell, whatever the case may be. And so I think that's really, you know, something important to think about when we're using that term. But of course, that's just my feeling. I think it's really important. I think there are a number of different factors that are listed here that are really included in the original social determinants of health information from the CDC. Alone, all of these things, you know, we know they're not indicative of abuse or neglect. However, when they are coupled with all of these other things happening, they can push a family in that direction. So when we talk about social influencers of health, we're talking about economic stability, right? And so that is poverty, food insecurity. When we talk about education, we're talking about, you know, did you graduate from high school? Do you have language or literacy skills? Social and community context, that's really, you know, have you experienced discrimination? Has anyone in your family been incarcerated? Health and healthcare. So access to healthcare. Do you have access to healthcare? Are you health literate? Many people aren't health literate. I mean, I think even me working for a healthcare organization, you know, it's sometimes the doctor talks to you and you want to say, can you please talk in plain language because I'm not understanding exactly what it is you're saying is going on. And then neighborhood and built environment, you know, do you have access to healthy foods? Do you have crime and violence in your neighborhood? So these are all really important things that do influence your health, but they don't determine your health outcome. That's the important distinction that I like to make when I talk about social influencers of health. Next slide. So toxic stress. So, you know, positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. Some people talk about toxic stress and they say, oh God, I've experienced high levels of toxic stress today. Well, did you really, or did you just have some stress? Because toxic stress is a little bit different. So positive stress, that's starting kindergarten. That's an example of positive stress. Tolerable stress could be, you know, the death of a pet. Toxic stress is adverse childhood experiences, right? These are things that are constant and persistent in our life. And I think that's the big difference. If you have something that is constant and persistently causing you stress, that's a toxic level of stress. Next slide. So when we talk about toxic stress, I can't help but include this slide because I think, you know, this is pretty impactful, right? If you look at the brain on the left, that's a brain of a healthy child. And if you look at the brain on the right, that is actually a child who was experiencing severe neglect in an orphanage, in a Romanian orphanage. So they actually took the brain and kind of looked at the differences between a healthy child brain and a severe emotional neglect brain, which I think is pretty incredible. So stress affects our brains, literally changes the way our brain functions. There are changes in the way our brain is structured as a result of toxic stress. It can make people more impulsive. It can make us more hyperactive. And there's a lot of research going on right now that's really looking at ADHD and whether children are instead suffering from toxic stress, not mental illness. That's not to say that that's the case with everything, but I think it's something we should be thinking about. Toxic stress makes it difficult for us to be able to handle stress in general. And of course, it can lead to a number of physical and mental health problems and really create difficult problems with you know, learning and memory even. Next slide. So I like this slide a lot, and I took this from a friend of mine, Dr. Maria McColgan from the CARES Institute. So to really put this into context, when we look at kind of how toxic stress affects the brain, the first 2 years of life are critical periods for brain development. You can see the trajectory from the newborn to 6 months and 2 years and how those neurons are working together, right? You can see that there are few connections in the beginning, but by 6 months and then 2 years, they become much more developed. And all of this is directly influenced by our genes, by our environment, by our experiences, which is really the foundation for learning and behavior and ultimately our health. So chronic exposure to traumatic events, especially during a child's early years, as we saw, can impair learning in the classroom. We see this with kids who have difficulty with attention and memory, and kids who have a hard time focusing in the classroom. We also see this when we have kids that have, lower grades or difficulty reading, and of course, high rates of absences in the classroom or suspensions or any of those sorts of things. Next slide. So when I think about the ACEs research, I don't like to think about it. I know it's awful and it's hard to hear about, but I think it's preventable, right? When unaddressed, they can contribute to all of these, economic costs like unemployment, loss of productivity, healthcare spending, the list really goes on. I think when they looked at this data, the last data that I could find was back in 2008. It was approximately $124 billion estimated to be as large as $585 billion. So I think, they are preventable. They're a preventable cause of mental illness. They're a preventable cause of drug and alcohol abuse, particularly in women. They are a preventable cause of HIV high-risk behavior. And they're a significant contributor to some of the leading causes of death. Next slide. So protective factors. Protective factors can really help to, their conditions, their events and conditions and characteristics that children and families and really just environments as a whole, communities as a whole, that can increase your chances of healthy development and positive life outcomes despite exposure to significant adversity. So when you look at the top here, parental resilience, this is your ability to cope and bounce back from types of challenges and handle everyday stressors. And we all either, we get this from our own parents, right? We get some of those skills from our own parents, and some of it's just kind of innate. Concrete supports in times of need. So this is financial security, so that you feel like you can meet your day-to-day expenses, your rent, your food, your electricity, all of that sort of thing. Your knowledge of parenting and child development. Do you feel like you have accurate information about raising your children and appropriate expectations depending on their developmental age? Do you know how to, set limits with your kids? Do you understand all of those sorts of things? Social connections, so friends, family members, neighbors, and other members of a community who provide emotional support and assistance to you. Do you have that? Social and emotional development in children. Does the child have an ability to interact positively with other people and communicate their emotions effectively? And finally, nurturing and attachment. The need for kids to experience nurturing and develop a bond with a caring adult. Do you have that ability to have that nurturing relationship and that attachment? Next slide. So the socio-ecological impact of COVID-19 on families and children has been adopted by the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. And there are 5 stages of the model that really look at the potential negative impacts on the child, the family, and the community, and larger society, and those norms during and after any kind of pandemic. And so I thought this was particularly relevant when we're talking about ACEs, because really, sociocultural, so when we're looking at that, there's still stigma and implicit bias and racism and such misinformation out in the world. When we look at the societal level, we still have decreased access to basic services right now, and especially right now, given our current situation. At the community level, there's a breakdown of trust and extreme stress from lack of resources for families. And again, we're experiencing this a lot. At the family level, there's a high risk of violence and abuse in the household and isolation from family and friends. And as a child, there's a risk of toxic stress and an impact on development. Next slide. So I found this when I was doing the research for this presentation. I found it on ACEs Connection, and I thought it was fantastic. So 10 ways to avoid ACEs during the pandemic. So we need to think about social connection and physical distance, not social distancing. It's, I think, the worst term that's ever been put out there. I understand the intent, but the intent is really more physical distance. It's not to keep people socially isolated. I think that's dangerous, and I think that's something that's, you know, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are isolated right now, and it's really concerning. So we need to continue to nurture those relationships with our friends and our neighbors while we're, you know, still keeping ourselves safe. And we need to talk with our kids. Children might be fearful or simply missing their routines. So it's important to keep having those conversations. We need to reach out for support when we need help. It's okay to ask for help. I think, you know, I think that's coming out more and more now with this pandemic, but, you know, if you have, for any reason, if you have a baby in your home and you need some help, if you need respite, we need to be able to reach out for support. We also need to be able to figure out how to reach out to support others. You know, is there a neighbor who you haven't seen out in a while? Maybe checking in on them and making sure they're okay. You can do it at a safe distance, but do it just to reach out to let them know you care. It can really make a big difference. 5, addressing concrete family needs. So, you know, shelter-in-place orders may lead families to struggling to meet their basic needs. So you could offer to get help by getting them diapers or cooking a meal or dropping off food or anything like that. We need to be addressing parental mental health, because if we're not healthy as parents, our children are going to suffer as a result. So depression is really common, but it's also treatable. Those with a history of depression and parents with newborns, people who've lost their jobs, those are a really hard time. I mean, it's a really hard time right now. And I think, you know, reaching out for help, reaching out to your family doctor, your pediatrician, anyone who is, you know, skilled in being able to treat signs of depression, all of that is really important. We need to be able to check in with the children in our life, right? So school teachers and early childhood educators can recognize signs of child abuse. Children who are out of sight because their schools are closed are more vulnerable. So we need to be able to check in with kids that we know that might be vulnerable. We also need to be on the lookout for family violence. So that's, you know, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about that later, so I won't go into detail with this. But there's definitely a concern of this isolation and this increased violence that we need to be looking out for. Engaging with our community. I know we're doing this virtually now for the most part, but there are still opportunities to engage, you know, locally, statewide, etc., to really figure out about, you know, to answer those questions from a family perspective on how they can be helpful. It's really important to keep those conversations going. And lastly, to create positive moments. You know, it's a really stressful time, so taking time to go for walks, play games, all of those sorts of things, really important, especially now. Next slide. So I wanted to go through some different developmental periods of time and really share kind of what some of that distress looks like in different age groups. So for infants and toddlers, you know, there's a sad demeanor. You can tell if an infant and a toddler is sad just by their demeanor. Do they have a flat affect? You know, they're not really reacting to you. They're not responding to you. They're not, you don't feel like they're attaching to you like they were. They're having issues sleeping, or, you know, particularly with toddlers, are they aggressive or impulsive? Next slide. So it's important to communicate to a child that their task right now is to stay healthy by avoiding exposures, and that by staying away from others, they can help protect those who are vulnerable, which makes the difficulty of staying at home much more acceptable. So, you know, talking to school-age kids, eliciting those concerns, asking how they're doing, talking about the importance of sleep, nutrition, exercise, play. We were just joking about this before the call. It's hard to do all of those things, and it is, but pick one thing that you can really focus on that day. Encourage kids to meet up online with their friends to keep that connection going. Practice that mindfulness and spend time outside. We can still go outside. We just need to do it safely. Next slide. And concerns of in teens, you know, things to look for in teens. If there are unusual changes in their mood or their behavior, if they have a lack of interest in activities that, you know, they used to enjoy, difficulty falling asleep, some of the same things that we talked about, but changes in their weight, their memory, appearance. With an appearance, I say with, you know, really out of the ordinary, because of course, you know, if we're not going to school, I don't know about everyone else, but I know my daughter at least is in her pajamas most of the time. So that's, you know, that's a little bit different, but we, you know, we need to be looking at if there's a major problem in appearance and hygiene. If they're, you know, doing some risky behaviors, if you see them using drugs or alcohol, or, you know, they start talking about death or suicide. I know that's a big deal right now, and it's a big concern. Next slide. So I thought I'd put a slide in here also about discipline during COVID. So, you know, it's important right now to really start those conversations, if we haven't already, with our kids, really trying to engage them in some constructive activities. This is the time when kids who are bored and frustrated, they're more likely to act out. You know, everyone's had their lives kind of turned upside down with everything that's happened. They're out of school, they can't play with their friends. It's a rough time. So helping them with their fears is really important. You know, it's really important to also, you know, curtail the amount of news that they watch depending on their age. And having those conversations and maybe watching it with them if they're old enough, so that you can kind of have those conversations and that open dialogue with them. Calling a timeout, and I'm not talking about the kids' timeout, I'm talking about the adult timeout. I think sometimes it's important to take a step back and say, you know, mom needs a timeout or dad needs a timeout, and removing yourself from a situation when you're frustrated, because it's a stressful time. We're all very frustrated and on edge, kids and adults. Know when not to respond. So sometimes that's really important. Not responding is much more effective than responding in the moment and saying something that you wish you hadn't. Catch kids being good. You know, that's really important to recognize when they're doing something good. They know when they're doing something bad. Most of the time it's to get attention from you. So it's important to catch them doing something good and recognize them for that. And really just give them your attention. I think that's really important. It's really hard. I recognize this is really hard. I have two kids myself, 12 and 15, who are at home with my husband and I, who are both trying to work, and we are doing the school thing. Very, very challenging time. Try to take those breaks, even if it's for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, just to, you know, go play ping pong in my case, or whatever the case may be. But it is really important to be able to do that. Next slide. So finding the silver lining, I think, you know, we've all talked about this with, you know, what's currently going on. Right now, we have some opportunities, right? Where most of us are home with our kids. So keeping some sort of routine helps kids feel secure. Planning those virtual play dates can be helpful. Just really learning to be creative with our time and with what we have, you know, what we can do. Reading books together. There's all kinds of virtual tours out there. And if you'd like, I'm happy to share some of those with you all. Just going outside. We have the ability to do that now, where we can do it safely. Getting outside is really important. cooking and eating together. We have time now to spend to be able to, you know, cook together and then eat meals together. Having family game nights. I know we do this often in our family. And really, again, talking to your kids about what's going on and how they're feeling about the situation. And remember to take breaks yourself, you know, take care of yourself, go down, you know, go down in your basement and walk on the treadmill or take a walk by yourself, whatever you need to do, really important. And finally, just don't take frustrations out on your kids because everyone's having a hard time right now, including your kids. Next slide. There are 7 evidence-based practices for self-care that are outlined by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris from the Center for Youth Wellness, things we can do. So things we can do, we can, you know, nurture those supportive relationships that we have. We can try to get more sleep if we can. We can work on eating better. We can work on exercising or just moving in general. I know that's been a challenge for me. Working from home, just trying to make time to get up out of my chair has been a little bit of a challenge, but definitely something I'm working towards. Getting the mental health care that you need, just really trying to be mindful of what's happening, and really just getting out in nature. I think these are really important things. These are things we can do, and I think they're really important to be able to do. I saw this quote from Dr. Gillespie. He is a pediatrician in Oregon at the Children's Clinic, and he's done a lot of work screening parents in particular in his practice for adverse childhood experiences. And he had this quote where connection is really the strongest factor in resilience. Are we checking in with family members or neighbors or friends to make sure they're safe, they're cared for, they're provided for? And then he talked about some of the stories of quarantine people singing to each other between buildings in China and in Italy. And I remember seeing that on the news, and I thought that was really, you know, we're not in this alone. We're all doing this together. It is something that's affecting everybody in the world right now. And I think it's just a really important thing to remember. Next slide. So I put a lot of resources here. Some are English and some in Spanish, whatever I could find. I was able to find some of those things. Some of them were from the Center for Youth Wellness, others were from New Jersey Department of Children and Families, and I found one on how to support kids during the coronavirus from an organization called Childmind, which was really, really helpful. And there are other resources on the next slide as well, particularly on how to talk to kids about COVID. Again, some of them are from Harvard, Childmind, PBS, New York Times even, but I thought they were really, really well done and really helpful. So if you would like to look at those, they're there for you to take a peek at. We have some upcoming webinars. You're welcome to join us. You'll get this slide deck after, so you'll be able to click and join if you're interested. And we're just continuing to do this work with you. And I think there's one more slide and that's it. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take questions or however you want to handle that, Jeanne and Nicole.
Thank you so much, Aldina. That was an amazing wealth of information.
It's a lot, right?
It's a lot, and it's important and not an easy thing to talk about or to hear, you know, perhaps, but so important for us to talk about. So thank you very, very much. That was really wonderful. I love the way you made it very relevant and brought in, the effects of COVID and people's lives in relation. And I think one of the take homes for me is really nuancing the language we use in this work, you know, from social influencers of health versus social determinants. When you really are thinking about that, is so much more relevant to what we are really talking about and what is important in physical distancing versus social distancing. I mean, I think that when we start to think about the language that we're using, we really move, begin to move the needle toward, really impacting those systemic changes that need to happen in order for health.
Language matters. Language really does matter. And I think it's, I think it's really important. I think we don't think about it enough. But I do believe that, language really does matter. It makes a difference. Yeah,
it does. I mean, that's a huge take home for me today. And Nicole and I were kind of chatting on this side and saying we're going to start using some of this language, because we do a lot of work in this area as well. So thank you again. There are so many great questions in the chat box. And Nicole, I think we have a few minutes for questions, right?
We do. We have about 6 minutes before the next presentation. And I want to say thank you again, because it, definitely, in the work that we do with women and their families, we know that all these things come up on a daily basis, and more so now that we're seeing people having to been at home, and the unfortunate numbers of the abuse rates, whether it's with children or domestic violence. And, it's just important that we talk about it. There's so many things that I feel now in this time that have come out that we know them in the background, but it's necessary to talk about. And one of the person had a question about, so has there been discussion to include systemic racism in ACEs? I think that's a really great question.
Yeah, I mean, if I had anything to say about it, I definitely think it needs to be in there. I think there's a lot of conversations happening now about that. I think there's a lot of discussions, but everyone's kind of having them in silos right now. I think the biggest thing that we need to do, just as a state in general, is be able to have those conversations with our state and community partners, to come to have that as part of our dialogue, right? Because, if the CDC is going to do whatever the CDC wants to do, and this organization is going to do whatever they want to do, but if we as a state can agree that these are important things to include, I think there are so many things that aren't included in the conversation. When I look at, what some of those, even adverse community environments things are, discrimination is in there.
Yes.
But I really think it needs to be louder. I think some of the things in there just need to be a little louder and a little more prominent, because clearly we have some really big issues in our world today that just, kind of make me crazy. So.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that, from the state to county to local levels of people mobilizing to discuss the systemic racism that it involves in community and income and all those things, that we need to collectively come together and discuss it.
Absolutely. And we need to have these conversations openly. And I feel like we need to be talking also about implicit bias, because everybody has implicit bias in some way, shape, or form. And we need to be able to have those open dialogues to get to a place where we can move.
Yes.
Because I think for too many years, we've just been, well, if we're quiet and we don't talk about it, it'll all just go away. Well, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't, right?
Right. Yes. This has been my speech for the past couple of weeks. But so there's another question. I think it's a very important question. There's so many important questions, but this one, it says, is there data connecting rural areas, lack of resources, similar to data you shared relating to poverty and 3 times the increase, similar to the connection to suicide rates in rural communities? So I think rural communities is another area where there's a lot going on.
I would assume that's the case, but I don't have the data off the top of my, at the top of my head. But I would assume, when you have lack of resources available, I think it's definitely a challenge. That's one of the reasons why we started some of the telepsychiatry work that we do with the chapter, to make sure to get that access
Right.
for families.
Right, because as we know, in rural areas, there's not enough mental health services or service
Absolutely.
providers that are going into those areas. I know the system of care struggles with that quite a bit. And there's a lot of conversations that happen with that. So I'm going to give you one more question.
Sure. And I did see some people floating by, can I connect with Aldina? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Give them my direct contact information. You don't have to use the CAN email. You know my email, Nicole. So feel
Yes.
free to give that to anyone can connect with me and ask questions. It's fine.
So this person, my question is, in the documentary Resilience, they showed how some interventions in the classroom about toxic stress and ACEs actually had positive impact on school-age children. What can community organizations do to make similar differences to a group versus what they can be done on an individual basis?
That's a big question.
Yep.
There's a lot of work being done right now. So, I mean, I think engaging your community right now, we're doing this in the city of Camden, in Cumberland County, and in Cape May. We basically have school superintendents meeting with healthcare teams and other community organizations and parents, really all sitting down at the same table. And this was, I have to tell you, this was a direct result, this community collaborative work was a direct result of parents in the city of Camden saying, schools and healthcare, you need to talk to each other. You're not doing a good job talking to each other. So we created this community collaborative, and it has evolved into more community organizations joining to really figure out how to work together to address it. I think it's, form your own group. It can start from anywhere. If someone is in a community and they want to make a difference, form a group. Work with your school, work with your healthcare in your area to form that, to really begin those conversations. We're also working with a person in Cape May. We work with some folks to provide education directly to the schools about adverse childhood experiences and how to work with some kids who might be a little challenging to work with, and work with those kids who are super quiet, who clearly have something going on. And really how to, what are some tools and tips for them to work with those kids and also work with their families.
Exactly.
Aldina, someone is asking, is there a guide, workbook, or handouts as takeaways for families? So bringing this information in a more sort of compact way to families. Do you have any literature or?
I would say probably the best resource that I think is really, really helpful is ACEs Connection. So if you go to ACEs Connection, it's for anyone can go on. You sign up to be a member, but it's free. And it's just great resources for anyone to be able to access in a number of different areas, and they have just so much information out there. There's also a resource that was created by, I want to say it was the Center, I think it's the Center for Youth Wellness, and I can send you the link, that specifically for parents on how to, stress health, I think it is. So I think it's really, that would be really helpful. So I can send that to you. And then, the National AAP has a website called healthychildren.org, and there are all kinds of resources there for families. It's really vetted by doctors. So it's not, you're not going to get some, crazy information that's not, based on evidence. It's going to be reliable, helpful, useful information. So I'm happy to send those links to you, and you can get them to folks.
Yeah, thank you very much.